Now, the Boeing 727 was the ultimate compromise, with one airline wanting a more fuel-efficient replacement for their 4-engine jets, whilst another airline still wanted 4 engines so they could fly over water. So in the end, they all compromised, and then they designed this 3-engined tri-tail. And in this video, I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of this aircraft behind me. First, I'm going to walk around and point out what makes it unique and interesting, and then we're going to crawl inside and have a look. So let's go and check it out. I make videos about planes. This includes reviews of flights from across the world and detailed tours through significant aircraft in museums. If you're into these types of videos, then make sure you check out my channel and subscribe. Now, this aircraft on display at the fantastic Museum of Flight in Seattle is the very first 727, the prototype that went on to fly for United Airlines. First up, you'll notice the black nose cone, which was common for that era. The reason is that there was a weather radar inside. Therefore, they couldn't cover it with metal, but instead used fiberglass. Then, to keep it waterproof, they used a rubber layer over it, and that was the colour black. Later on, they developed surfaces that could manage both water and be painted over, hence why most newer aircraft don't have those black noses. You might also notice that the whole forward part of the aircraft looks familiar, and it is. In fact, it's identical to both the 707 and the 737 that you can see now. Changing as little as possible helped keep parts cheaper and more familiar for both pilots and maintenance crew. And as we zoom in, we pass through these two pitot tubes, which provide the flight crew with the aircraft's speed. The 727 had unique chined wheels at the front, which is difficult to see, but the edges were angled outwards rather than being rounded like standard wheels. This was to direct water out and downwards so that it wouldn't spray upwards and over the wings, which were located quite a long way further back and be ingested by the rear-mounted engines. What you may not realize is that most airliners don't have brakes on the nose wheel, but it was actually an option on the 727 and would reduce the braking distance by almost 500 feet. A major requirement for the 727 was that it could operate at regional airports with smaller runways, so a shorter landing distance was preferred. And some of these smaller airports wouldn't be able to provide ground power. Therefore, the 727 was the first Boeing airliner with a gas turbine auxiliary power unit, which was used to start the main engines as well as power the systems while the main engines were turned off. Up until then, airliners like the 707 would be fully reliant on ground power units. Almost all airliners have them now, but an interesting fact is that the Concorde doesn't have an APU, as it would only ever operate at large airports that would have easy access to ground power. But back to the 727, and there obviously wasn't room for an APU in the standard position at the tail, so it was actually positioned inside the main landing gear wheel well. The exhaust is difficult to see, but it was positioned on the upper side of the right wing, and I'll point at that now. Now, the wings are also very important, but I'll mention those on the other side. There were two main variants of the 727, the 100, which is this one, and then the longer 200 series, which had two 10-foot extensions in front and behind the wings. There was also a single combi version with both passenger and cargo sections, but that wasn't very popular. Here we are at the tail with the 3 engines. Now, by putting them at the back, it means that the wing can be low as there's no engines underneath it. Therefore, the whole aircraft can sit lower, making it easier for passengers and cargo to be loaded at smaller airports. And being back there, the engines are still well clear of the gravel and other less desirable things found on rural runways. It's powered by 3 Pratt Whitney JT8D low bypass turbofans, which, by the way, were modified versions of the engines powering the US Navy A6 intruders. You'll notice that the engine number 2 is up high and located within the vertical stabilizer. Inside there is a S-duct, so that the thrust exits lower down. As I mentioned earlier, the APU, which for most aircraft would exit here, is located in the wheel well. The engines were incredibly noisy. In fact, in 1999, the US government passed a law to require all 727s to be retrofitted with a hush kit, and in 2010, all 727s, even with the hush kits, were banned from some Australian airports. But while the rear-mounted engines allowed for the whole aircraft to sit lower, it made maintenance more challenging, and especially for engine number 2. Although having 3 engines did allow for it to travel over water to the Caribbean islands, which was something that Eastern Airlines wanted in particular. Down here you've got the retractable tail skid to protect the long tail in case of over-rotation during takeoff. Again, being designed for rural airports, they installed an airstair which would open down from the fuselage.
Initially it could be opened during flight, but in 1971 D.B. Cooper hijacked a 727 and escaped via these stairs in flight, and he was never caught. So to stop this from happening, they installed the Cooper vane, which was an aerodynamic wedge that could twist with the airflow and create a physical barrier stopping the airstairs from opening during flight. At the museum here, there's a mannequin of Cooper standing here. Obviously, the 727 could easily fly on two engines, but could it fly on one? The answer is yes, and while it might be fairly unstable with the thrust all coming from one side of the jet, it could still go around and ascend with a single engine. Another interesting fact was that it could use the reverse thrust and back itself out of a bay, which removed the need for an airport tug, again making it much more versatile in small airports. An obvious complication of having a rear-mounted engine was where to put the horizontal stabilizers and elevators, so they were lifted up, forming a T-tail. They did investigate replacing the engines with quieter and more efficient high bypass turbofans, although they were much wider, and while they wouldn't have been a problem for the two outer engines, the middle engine was integrated into the fuselage, so they couldn't easily change it without redesigning the whole tail end. Once again, to operate at smaller airports, the wings had to create a lot of lift at low speeds, and the 727 was known as being much more stable at lower speed than many other airliners. On the wing's trailing edges, they installed triple slotted flaps, which worked to increase the wing's surface area. They were so effective that they went on to be used in the 747 several years later. If we zoom in here, you can see the flaps with the circular screw, which is used to deploy them, and these canoes here are aerodynamic covers for the flap mechanism. And by the way, these circular panels here are simply access ports to important structures underneath so that they can be inspected and maintained. And if we move right out to the end, we can see the fuel dump valve. There's also a NACA duct that allows air in to replace the space when fuel is burnt, and vice versa when the aircraft is being refueled on the ground. And then during ascent and descent, it equalizes the air pressure of the tank and the atmosphere. Moving to the wing's leading edge, the lack of an engine meant that the lift devices could be used along the entire wing, thus again improving lift. You can see the extendable slats, and this device here is a wing fence which stops the wind from moving sideways and potentially stalling the entire wing. You can see these on a whole range of aircraft, from fighter jets to airliners. The wings and the whole shape of the aircraft was especially slippery, so the 727 was pretty fast with a top speed of Mach 0.9, although cruising was usually a little slower to save fuel. And then on the inner part of the wing, you've got these Kruger flaps and some landing lights. Now let's go inside and have a look. Now it was closed when I visited in early 2022, but here's footage from 2017, although you'll need to reorient yourself as the interior footage is from the opposite side. The 727 is a narrow-body airliner, although everything was back then, as the first wide-body 747 didn't arrive until 1969, and then the Airbus A300 in 1972. So until those arrived, this was a very big aircraft. Inside, it has a single aisle, and the standard economy seats are in a 3-3 layout that is familiar with anyone who flies these days. What's interesting is how inefficient they were with the interior space, with these thick, chunky chairs, although the legroom itself actually looks similar to these days. You've got these two storage sections here, which I'm sure an accountant could have fit in another row of 6 seats. Moving forward is the first class section in a 2-2 layout, and the vibrant colours were popular back in those days. There's an especially large toilet on the right hand side, and then we're looking into the cockpit. As I mentioned earlier, the front section was the same as the 707 and 737, therefore a lot of the components in the cockpit were also carried over. As you can see, it's all analog with round dials, and on the right was the flight engineer's seat, so that it was a 3-person crew. In fact, the additional cost of an extra crew member was one of the 727's drawbacks in comparison to the 737 and 757, which just had 2 pilots, as the flight engineer's job was automated and taken over by the first officer. The 727 was a huge commercial success, with over 1,830 being built between 1963 and 1984. Even today, 4 decades after production stopped, there are still a small number of 727s still flying. Check out my channel for similar tours around the first 747 and 737. Thanks for watching.